The indigenous imprisonment has become one of the country's predicaments. The imprisonment rate of indigenous people is soaring. A recent research from the Rigma Witten and West Mountain of the Conversation showed that the proportion of indigenous in prison has increased since 1991. In 2015, indigenous Australia made up 27.4% of the national prison population while only making up only 2.5% of the overall Australian population. Indigenous people were 15.4 times more likely to be detention than non-Indigenous people, especially in Northern Territory around 85% of prisoners are Indigenous. Apart from those chilly figures, the imprisonment rate of Indigenous juveniles should invite more concern. 59% of people in juvenile detention are Indigenous. Young Indigenous people in detention are 74% more likely to end up in adult prisons. Even Indigenous children are 26 times more likely to be in detention than non-Indigenous children.
In 1991, the Royal Commission investigated 99 deaths in the custody and came up with 339 recommendations in order to reduce the imprisonment of Indigenous Australia. People may ask, how could this issue remain this serious after 25 years since the Royal Commission announced their report? In fact, the situation is getting worse. Imprisonment rate has doubled from 14% at time of Royal Commission. The reason attributed to the high imprisonment rate might be rooted in the criminal justice system of Australia. The justice system is problematic since it encourages police to place people in detention. Mandatory sentencing aims to protect the public and ensure community safety by harshly punishing criminals. However, this has created a cycle of imprisonment and reoffending. Moreover, the system is prejudiced. It places Indigenous people in a disadvantaged place. For example, the Northern Territory government introduced the paperless arrest laws, which allows officers to jail a person with no warrant and no charge for 4 hours. This policy contradicts to the Royal Commission's recommendation, which suggests that jailing people should be as the last resort. The failure of the Royal Commission pointedly indicates that the government have failed to act in the past 25 years. However, this problem has become a national crisis and immediate responses are required.
A lot of us are now familiar with the mistreatment, abuse, and torture of youths at Dondale Youth Detention Centre. Australia's Shame, an episode broadcast by current affairs program Four Corners, has documented these injustices. A link will be provided to the episode within the description box. Young detainees at Dondale were subject to weeks inside the Behavioural Management Unit, or BMU, a small cell with no windows, poor ventilation, and no running water. In fact, the only water available in the cell was from the toilet. The Dondale youth were also physically and mentally abused, being tear-gassed and racially vilified by prison guards and staff. Yesterday, on October 11th, 2016, marked Day 1 of the Royal Commission into the Protection and Detention of Children in the Northern Territory. National Children's Commissioner Megan Mitchell bemoaned the poor education standards and lack of a robust complaints process as major pitfalls of youth detention centres across Australia and in Dondale. Like caged animals, Mitchell described how the young detainees were fearful of making complaints, as many were concerned about retribution by the staff. Furthermore, Mitchell opined that the lack of a Bill of Rights in Australia made it even more difficult to ensure the government complied with its obligations as a signatory to various conventions. As a result, it is increasingly important to support the OPCAT, or Optional Protocol to the Convention Against Torture, an extension of the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment of punishment. The Australian government has signed the OPCAT but has not yet ratified the agreement. Under the OPCAT, State parties must agree to internal inspections of places of detention by the United Nations Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture. This would also lead to unannounced and unrestricted visits to youth prisons and centres by independent national and international monitoring bodies with financial independence. Not only can these bodies review and comment on laws and policies, such as the infamous spit hood placed on Dylan Voller at Dondale, but they can also conduct confidential interviews with children in detention to make sure their voices are heard. The OPCAT can ensure higher national standards in prisons and give young detainees a voice. The good news is, you and I, everyday citizens of Australia, can make a difference. On our Facebook page and in the description of this podcast, we have posted web links to an online petition run by Amnesty International where you can email the Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull to call for the ratification of OPCAT. We hope this podcast has given you an insight into the issues that pervade the youth justice system in Australia and the programs and initiatives that can put Australia back onto the right path in ensuring equality, effectiveness, and empathy towards young prisoners and young Indigenous prisoners. Remember, you can make a difference. Check out our description boxes for more information. Thank you. According to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare in 2015, 59% of young people in juvenile detention are Indigenous. Amanda Porter, researcher at the Indigenous House of Learning at the University of Technology, Sydney, opines that the removal of Indigenous children and subsequent placement into detention centres is comparable to the agony, mistreatment, and injustices suffered by the stolen generations in the 20th century. With Indigenous overrepresentation in prisons steadily rising and a history of racism, neglect, and prejudice pervading the Indigenous community, Porter states that imprisonment rates in Australia have now moved far beyond a criminal justice issue. Rather, it has become a social issue that must be addressed by all Australians. Indeed, politicians and policymakers must take notice and work on rectifying this issue. However, everyday citizens like you and I can also make a meaningful difference. We believe difference can be achieved in 3 ways. Number 1, by accessing and informing ourselves with meaningful and accurate information about youth and Indigenous imprisonment issues. 2, engaging in meaningful, rational, and critical public deliberation with the aim of cultivating a mutual understanding about youth Indigenous imprisonment issues. And number 3, spreading the word and facilitating avenues for others to access accurate and insightful information about youth Indigenous imprisonment, enabling them to engage and participate in the public debate surrounding these issues.
In this podcast, we'll be highlighting several useful interventions, strategies, and programs that we believe can step up the mistreatment and torture of youth in juvenile detention and also curtail the increasing rate of Indigenous youth imprisonment. Moreover, we hope to equip you with the knowledge and avenues to make a meaningful change to stop the mistreatment and overrepresentation of Indigenous youth in juvenile detention. All research we draw upon will be recorded in the description, as well as podcasts on our Facebook page ATS2440 Prisons. Mandatory sentencing was a topic covered in a video posted on our ATS2440 Prisons Facebook and YouTube pages. A link to this video will be provided in the description section of this podcast. To recap, Hale Tubbs of the University of Western Australia opines that mandatory sentencing involves legislative interventions by the government that set a minimum mandatory sentence of certain offences. Consequently, they could tell a judge discretionary power to take into account a case of particular circumstances that could reduce the sentence. Mandatory sentencing aims to reduce crime in 2 ways: by removing the opportunity for criminals to offend by locking them up, and deters them through threats of jail time and serious penalties.
A 2014 edition of Fact Check, published by the ABC, details the introduction of mandatory sentencing in Australia. The Northern Territory first implemented mandatory sentencing laws in 1997 to curtail property crime. Under the laws, first-time offenders of a property crime were imprisoned for a fortnight, 90 days for a second strike, and a year for a third property crime offence. Western Australia also implemented a 3-strike imprisonment regime in 1996 for home burglary convictions. Experts find it difficult to correlate mandatory sentencing with a decrease in crimes. While some studies suggest crime has fallen under these type measures, the Victorian Sentencing Advisory finds no clear link between sanction severity and levels of offending. From a more critical outlook, Dean of Bond University's Law Faculty, Geraldine Mackenzie, states that little evidence has been found that substantiates mandatory sentencing as a viable method of deterring potential offenders for violent crimes, especially those involving drugs and alcohol. Evidently, mandatory sentencing has done little to curb rates of Indigenous imprisonment, with 27% of Australia's prison population consisting of Indigenous prisoners. A glaring statistic, considering they account for only 2.5% of the total Australian population. Furthermore, on average, it costs approximately $440,000 a year for each young person in detention. There are, however, suggestions of a more equitable and effective solution rather than mandatory sentencing. Justice reinvestment is a data-driven and more cost-effective approach that focuses on building alternative pathways for potential offenders and stronger communities by diverting money that would normally be spent on prisons into community services and support. Justice reinvestment aims to intervene and prevent crime before it happens by ensuring the community is actively involved in the ownership of their issues, but also in the ownership of potential solutions and initiatives that may prevent these crimes. Tom Culmer, Chancellor of the University of Canberra, points to justice reinvestment's success in the United States of America, with implementation of reinvestment programs at state and county level said to have reduced offences and saved taxpayers tens of millions of dollars. A justice reinvestment approach is now being trialled in 2 towns in New South Wales, according to Smart Justice Australia. The Ramanguka Justice Reinvestment Pilot Project in the small New South Wales town of Burke has shown much promise and is a partnership between Just Reinvest New South Wales, the Burke Aboriginal Community Working Party, and the Australian Human Rights Commission, with a collective impact approach to ensure new and stronger relationships across the different sectors to ensure lasting social change, as well as a strong focus on data-driven decision-making and empowerment of the community and new stakeholders. The Burke program has made some promising interventions. Early years education is a major focus, with an early years transition centre opening in Burke 3 years ago to enable young children, mostly aged 4, to get used to learning environments. Free driving lessons have also led to the lowest number of driving offences in Burke in 10 years. Finally, a focus on ending domestic violence has shown positive signs, while directly addressing the problem of the rapidly growing contingent of Indigenous women in prisons, many of whom have been affected by domestic violence. In Burke, police are now required to undertake follow-up visits to perpetrators and domestic violence victims under the new Justice Reinvestment Program. Since this initiative began 3 months ago, not a single case of domestic violence reoffending has occurred.
Mentoring program and culture centers has also made important contribution to breaking the system circle of young Indigenous imprisonment. The Australian Indigenous Mentoring Experience focus on mentoring students throughout high school and into university by building their skill, opportunities, belief, and confidence to go and succeed. In 2014, AIME student has an average year 12 attainment of 93.2%, a huge success. The National Centre of Indigenous Excellence also provide a holistic range of programs encompassing learning about arts, culture, healthy, sports, and innovation.
While it is still in the early stages of development, justice reinvestment programs have already shown to have highly positive and effective outcomes. Further challenges are bound to manifest themselves. However, instead of investing in prisons and perpetuating the cycle of Indigenous and young Indigenous imprisonment, we believe steps can be taken to intervene and prevent crime before it even happens.